Well, to start off, we'll let you know a little bit about it.
Welcome to RetroWare TV. We have looked at Policenauts as a story, a game, and the inevitable inspiration for future writers and game designers. As of late 2010, the Policenauts translation patch has garnered over 30,000 downloads from policenauts.net. This does not include the availability of the fully patched game through torrent sites and other web pages. Thanks to Mark Laidlaw, Artemio Urbina, Michael Sawyer, and a handful of other programmers and fans, Policenauts became one of the most successful and celebrated unofficial localizations in video gaming history. As we conclude our look at Policenauts, we were able to interview the men behind the localization project, getting a glimpse into the challenges, pitfalls, and successes of what has become one of the most ambitious and successful fan projects ever carried out by video game enthusiasts. From an appreciation of the Japanese language, combined with skills in programming, a group of individuals set out to not only translate, but also localize and even correct glitches in a classic game that had never been played by the English-speaking world. For the conclusion of Policenauts, a video game odyssey, we give you the story of why and how this game was reproduced and localized by a few fans of Hideo Kojima's work. We spoke with Michael Sawyer, one of the key programmers, as well as Artemio Urbina, the originator of this project.
For me, the thing that attracted me most to Policenauts as a narrative is the same thing as in Snatcher. It's the specific attention to detail and the creation of a world with so much background and background for the characters, and that don't necessarily contribute to the main plot, but give you the essence of a real-life world into which you are exploring.
I really like the dichotomy of old versus new that's explored in it, especially how Jonathan is kind of tied to the old world. You can especially see in symbolically in his cigarette, which has no place on the space colony, but how he won't give it up. And I know I guess it's sort of pervasive that way, and it's kind of this notion of as technology advances and we go further and further along that, it's I guess sort of a cautionary note.
In the year 2000, with a love for Kojima games, specifically Snatcher, in his native Mexico, Artemio Urbina began the process of delving into the elusive Policenauts. With a basic knowledge of the Japanese language and the ability to pull text from game ROMs, Artemio hoped to attract a potential translator to work on converting the Japanese story into English. It wasn't until he connected with another Snatcher enthusiast in a Metal Gear fan site did the beginnings of this odyssey coalesce. Someone who would give this game its due diligence in regard to preserving the Hideo Kojima voice and intentions, while maintaining the spirit of what is essentially a buddy cop movie with natural dialogue and interactions. Artemio met Mark Laidlaw, the individual who would become the main supervisor and driver of the localization efforts.
It was until Mark got on the project that I had some real backup. So far it was only the times that I had at the office or during the weekends that I tried just to hit the game and figure out the encoding. I did figure out encoding for Snatcher and for some other games before them. but Policenauts was a bit different.
Mark's attention to detail was pretty incredible and made me crazy at points. I think when we had our alpha, which was all text translated, he had a list of beta features, which I organized, which were, I think, numbered at about 86 things that he wanted changed, just as little one-off things.
He could tie in all the references to other Kojima games in an appropriate way, in ways that official translations usually can't, because the translator doesn't know the other games created by the same director, in this case Kojima.
Following the completion of this project, Mark had been the main interview focus for multiple gaming publications looking to learn more about the translation effort. While Mark has been an invaluable resource during the research and production steps of this retrospective, he decided to take a back seat during these interviews, leaving the discussion and the focus to Artemio and Michael. Policenauts not only required the addition of on-screen English subtitles for the spoken Japanese dialogue, but also the extensive text and menu systems needed translating as well. The intricacies of the Japanese language and the need to consider not only text, but also the intent, inflection, and tone behind the spoken phrases made Policenauts not simply a translation project, but also a more in-depth localization, much like the efforts taken in translating a novel for a different culture.
This was a localization versus a strict transliteration. And to that end, some of the more complicated concepts or emotional impact that the characters want to express, you can get that across by creatively interpreting that in your own words. And to that end, it wouldn't be a strict translation like word for word. So people who know some Japanese might notice here and there's a vocal disconnect with what's being said in the English subtitle. And it's definitely accurate, don't get me wrong. I mean, we wouldn't have spent so much time on this, if it were, it's just something we were going to make up. But a couple people, when the thing they like about unofficial translations is because they're not so heavily produced, you tend to get like the literal translation of what the person was talking about. But that makes it less palatable to audiences in general. So you have a trade-off where you say, because this is an unofficial project, we can write what we like, we can keep the original context in, as controversial as it may be. And then on the other hand, though, if you go too much to that route, then most English-speaking people who don't know anything about Japanese don't understand some of the cultural differences and concepts, so they don't understand what characters are particularly getting at. The way Mark put it was that localization is kind of a marriage between the translator and the original author, and in our case, we didn't have the original author to rely on, so we had to try to use the context as best we could to see what they were trying to convey in some of the dialogue.
Pulling game text from a Japanese game is a daunting task. Japanese characters are far more compact with the way they portray themes and words exhibited when comparing them to the goal of an English language counterpart. Hiragana and katakana, much like our own Roman alphabet, offer symbols that represent phonetic and syllabic sounds that are used to form words. This alone was one issue to overcome, but in the case of Policenauts, kanji was the larger issue, and the Policenauts translation team was not going to cut any corners.
The problem here was kanji. The game uses a very, very big set of kanji. If I remember correctly, it was like between 2,000 and 3,000 kanji. And the thing is that the kanji have a specific arrangement, just like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You have that in English. It doesn't represent all the kanjis that are possible in Japanese. It just uses the ones that it will use in the game. Okay? Just imagine, just for comparison, if you have a game in English and you didn't use the character B, let's say, just for comparison's sake, and you encode the game as A, C, D, E, F, G, and you try to decode that afterwards, it won't make sense because it's keeping the B, okay? The problem here is that we had to identify by hand each one of the kanjis that were and weren't used in the game based on the font set that a good friend, Cyber Warrior X, extracted from the Saturn version of the game, from the ROM, but we only have that specific font set as a graphic image, which each one of the kanjis has, I don't remember, was like 5 pixels wide by 6 pixels of height. So we had to, with that simple table, identify each one of the kanjis to have a relationship and then proceed with the text up.
Another added challenge to ROM hacking in general, but especially a game with a large text corpus like Policenauts, is different scenes actually all have the text encoded in different ways. So even if you crack the text dumping for one part, say the actual gameplay, it might be encoded differently. In the case of Policenauts, it was for the movie cutscenes, the voice-acted cutscenes, and then you have one-offs. The motorcycle scene in Act 2, which is only 12 lines of dialogue, is done entirely differently than the rest of the game. That alone took me a month, that one scene. And you have like little things like that. The devil's really in the details when it comes to ROM hacking projects, because there's always something that doesn't conform to the rest of it.
So you have to figure out how the game encodes the text, what is the specific set of characters it can represent, and figure out which segments of information in the game code are that specific data you're trying to figure out, and then convert them and interpret them as characters. But then another huge part comes in, that's bringing the text back to the game. The problem here is that Japanese is more compact in representing the ideas in terms of space, of bytes inside of the game code. So you have to most certainly expand the space that the game has. Of course, after that, you also have to deal with graphical changes, interface changes, and small details that keep coming and coming.
As work began, challenges arose throughout the process. Challenges that spanned the years that this project took to be completed. Programmers came and went, and years had gone by during the process. There was always the fear of being shut down by the powers that be, which led the group to making key moves throughout the project. Everything from registering the Policenauts.net website ahead of time in order to gauge sensitivities, or checking in on American copyrights associated to the game, and carefully gauging fan reaction in an effort to ensure that their pure fandom was not misconstrued or perceived as a threat by Konami.
I met Kojima in 2004, and I was really tempted to ask about the Policenauts translation and about the game, but of course I couldn't. There were some worries about Kojima Productions or Konami contacting us, but that was the main reason that we launched Policenauts.net. As you know, I bought the domains for Policenauts.com and Policenauts.net, and that was mainly for this project, but also as a way of testing waters, trying to figure out if there could be any action against us. So we launched the site without telling what we have so far. And of course, close to release, I was worried that they could shut us down. And that was the main reason that we decided to release on the date that we release. Of course, it was also Kojima's birthday, but it was on a death weekend for either USA or Japan. They didn't hold the copyright in the US. I checked every year to figure out if they tried to copyright it, and they didn't. So that was kind of also testing the waters. I was against disclosing that we were doing some advances. I always was in the position to have everything under curtains just because maybe they could stop us. So my main intention was always to have the project done and then released without further notice.
The issue too is the position that we're in, because it was unofficial, is they don't want to be seen as people, to have people encourage people to mod their games. And don't get me wrong, the translation project is not that, but to some people they don't see the difference. That also extends into the translation issue, because you are dealing with the dialogue of another company's intellectual property. So if you make them say something too offensive or too vulgar, then that could make people upset over at Konami, because now you're making it seem like, oh well, the reason this game wasn't brought over is because the characters are too, I don't know, they curse constantly or something like that, or it's too sexual in nature, let's say. You don't want to imply something about the intellectual property, so you don't want to go too nuts with that.
They are between the wall and the sword, right? They can't just attack us directly or attack a project like this, because they get the fan base against them. and they can't support it because they simply can't manage it legally.
Along with these political concerns, more technical issues cropped up that had nothing to do with the translation issues. This had to do with the original game's programming. As the translation project continued to work, they discovered issues and glitches within the game program itself. While they could have continued to work, leaving these errors and problems just the way they had been originally made in the game, this team took the extra step of correcting the problems and the programming inconsistencies that they found.
The two big ones are in the museum scene with the mosquitoes flying around. If you load a save game, you'll actually crash the game, and I think this is actually on hardware too. On hardware, I believe it either crashes or it just slows down, but it becomes unplayable. And if you actually look, Konami tried to cover it up by removing the option to load the game in some areas, but they didn't actually do it all the way. So we had to actually complete that work and try to circumvent that bug. It was a threading issue, which is really complicated at that low level of assembly programming. So we just had to complete their job of say okay, well they forgot to remove the load game option here, here, and here. Another big one is in the original Japanese game in the motorcycle sequence, the last 4 lines when Ed is talking to Meryl go by really fast in the PlayStation version, almost unreadably so. So we had to figure out a way to slow that down to give the player some time to read that. There's a lot of background detail that you might not even notice that we changed in the scene when you first get to VCPD. Outside one of the mechs, the shadow appears, and there's a tell-out that says Beyond Coast Police Department. And they actually, in the original game, the shadow gets cut off by the subtitle. For some reason, it just gets occluded and it doesn't look right. So we actually fixed that, which meant getting around the fact that Konami compressed the graphic in a proprietary format that we were unable to crack, but we were able to circumvent to put in our own compression algorithm in order to fit that graphic onto the disc, not take up any more space, and keep everything running smoothly. It was things like that that really, really drove me nuts. But at the end of the day, I am pretty proud of that project. I hope that doesn't come off arrogant, but it is really cool that and that's because of Mark. There were a lot of times I was like, look, this is enough. People who want to play Policenauts can. Come on. And he's like, no, we gotta have, Gates Becker's little shadow here touched up, things like that.
The project itself took many years to complete. Having lost one of their main programmers and his work was one of the larger hurdles that would only be jumped once Michael Sawyer came on board.
From the inception of the idea of trying to do the translation of the project till it was released, it was around 9 years. It was just periods of work. Our main developer had to leave for personal reasons, so the project got stalled again. And the thing was that we couldn't get his work. We couldn't get his source code and what he had been working on. We just had what I had. So it was until we finally got the communication going and got that that code back that some work could be started again. But it was back and forth in these situations, and it was until Mike arrived that we got the pace again. This was all because that in reality my intention from the beginning was just doing the text dump. Of course, I was interested in doing several other things which I tried helping, which weren't much. I worked mainly on the credits and on some small details and support development code. But I was really interested and excited when Mike got on board. I tried to give whatever I could.
Policenauts is a testament to science fiction and the innovative uses of technology in order to tell a narrative. Along with the translation project and programming concerns, delving into the technology and the validity of that technology was another role taken on by the team.
Like the Metal Gear Solids, the technology involved is based on real-life actual research. So, the O'Neill space cylinder and all the details mentioned in the game are factual to the O'Neill space station design. One of the beta testers was a space science, is going to school for space science actually, and in the translation notes he included a little write-up about about it, and he found it was very true to form even now, as the game is, even now as science has progressed, it's still pretty accurate.
Mark had to read a lot about space travel, about space stations. You don't know how much information he dug up into this just to correct some small details that were either wrong, and there was this huge problem about technical terms that were not properly written in Japanese, and he had to dive into those to figure out what was the correct term in English.
If you look at the scene with the Tokugawa Pharmaceuticals demo, when they talk about the other capsules and what's in them, there's, I think it's an indolin inhibitor and things like that. And he had to research, some pharmaceutical stuff, too, to make sure he got it all right. They're phonetically saying, indolin or, what have you. And you have to make sure that you're actually talking about the same thing to do an accurate translation.
Because Policenauts had never been available in English, it had the unique opportunity to not only receive reception based on the localization project, but on the gameplay as well. Policenauts, as it has been discussed already, is an acquired taste with a narrative that rewards patience and exploration at the expense of prolonged action sequences. And while the game has received mostly positive reception by Western audiences and reviewers, the translation effort has only received adoration and respect, as the community is completely aware of the effort taken in making this a reality.
The reception has been all positive mostly. It's very few that have small negative comments about language or specific words or specific situations, but in general it's been a very, very positive response.
With a unique story both behind the scenes and in the gameplay itself, Policenauts and the translation effort will forever be a highly regarded and respected entry into the history of gaming. As the years have passed, we can only imagine a future follow-up to Snatcher or Policenauts within a digital comic structure. But for those willing to take the time to experience this game from years past, they will have a story that they will remember for years to come. Policenauts is truly a video game odyssey.